with individuals building accessible businesses, advocating for inclusion, or excelling in adaptive sports. Our intention is never to speak on behalf of those with disabilities, but to provide a platform to amplify their ideas to a more accessible world. Today, I am joined by Cort Schneider. Dr. Schneider was born with cerebral palsy. He is the Director of Disability Services at the University of Richmond and is a professor. He is a passionate advocate for people with disabilities and adaptive recreation. He's a runner who uses forearm crutches and has completed 14 half marathons and dozens of 5K races. He even wrote a book called The Trial of Miles, a disabled runner's memoir. Currently, he has taken his passion for people with disabilities and adaptive recreation and has launched a podcast titled Sports Identity and the Disability Blue. This podcast, using the lens of sports to explore the stories of people with disabilities, sheds light on the experience of those with disabilities. The podcast is also a celebration of disability as a cultural idea. Cort, thanks for joining me today.
No problem. Thanks for having me on, man.
So maybe if you want to kind of take us back to what influenced, maybe we'll talk about your career path before your athletic endeavors. So current position at University of Richmond, maybe do you want to share with the audience what you teach and what your research focuses on?
Yeah, so I am the Director of Student Disability Services is my main job. So what that means is that students who qualify for accommodations under the Americans with Disabilities Act, Section 504 of the 1973 Rehabilitation Act, or the Fair Housing Act, because we have housing on campus, we provide reasonable, necessary, and appropriate accommodations. And so I'm the director of that office, and we serve about 16 to 17% of the student population. Of the total student population is registered with our office. And then I'm also an adjunct professor, an adjunct assistant professor in the Department of Special Education. So I teach, that's people who want to teach K through 12 in the space of working with people with disabilities. And then I also, on occasion, will teach a class which is called Rise of the Crips, Identity, and the Disability Blue, which is about the history of disability in the United States and the rise of identity and disability as a cultural concept or a cultural idea.
Do you think that 16 to 17% is pretty universal across universities in terms of the population that have a disability?
Yeah, so the national average, according to the National Center for Educational Statistics, is between 19 and 21%, depending on what year you look. I think the latest year was like 20.7%. And that also tracks with the general population. So a lot of people don't realize that, 1 out of 5 people identify or are disabled in some way. Most of those are invisible, but for sure, that sort of tracks with the national population. It's a very large minority group, and it's also the most fluid minority group. What I mean by that is it's the one you can sort of start your life in and not be a part of, but then you could be one banana peel, one car accident, one traumatic event from finding yourself now a member of this community, right? We often frame able-bodiedness as the human norm. One of the things in my career, both as an educator and an advocate, that I try to do is to get people to understand that actually disability, I think, is the norm, right? We are all in these bodies that are fragile, that are finite, that are limited. And that experience is actually the norm, the disabling experience, right? And there's a concept in disability research, which is the notion of temporarily able-bodied, that the able-bodied are really just temporarily able-bodied. And so one of my philosophical approaches is that being disabled is just fundamentally a part of the human experience. And if we see it that way, it changes the way in which we see a lot of things.
Yeah, I actually pretty much guest lectured at a university earlier today on that exact topic. We talked about models of disability, so social model versus the medical model. It was to a doctorate of physical therapy class, so third-year students who are about to become PTs, and we talked about how physical therapy inherently has some implicit biases. They have standards and they have norms that they want bodies to function as, which is inherently disabling because there's a lot of people that are going to exist outside those norms. And we just kind of talked about, I like how you phrase that disability is kind of the norm, and just how we get to a point where physical therapists look beyond someone's disability, not to ignore its presence, but to, I guess, come up with a more individualized treatment plan and not necessarily focus exclusively on how they want the body to function, but how the individual's actual unique abilities can function.
That's powerful. And when I think about it, in the world that I'm in, providing accommodations, we always look at, well, how does it impact you? Because that's actually the most important part. If we're providing adjustments or giving you access, we need to know how it functions. So that is almost more important than the diagnosis. Is
Exactly.
how is it functioning? I also like the notion of what you said there, and the way that I think about it when you read the literature is that disability is not about what bodies are, but what society thinks bodies should be and do. And that gets back to the point you said of physical therapy and what their standards might be, and the biases that might be in there. What I always say is, like, I have cerebral palsy, I walk on crutches. That in and of itself is not a disability. What makes it a disability is that I walk on crutches in a world that is not built to do so, right? And so it's the combination of social, psychosocial factors that impact it. And so it gets back to the notion of what do we think bodies are and should do? And a lot of the biases that people with disabilities face is because society has this notion about what bodies should be able to do and should not be able to do, and then judges bodies as deficient if they don't meet those standards.
Right. Do you think campus-wide universities are doing a good job of looking at their rec centers, accessibility and inclusivity, their cafeterias, like the different elements of a university? Because I was fortunate to get to work with a few great schools, University of Arizona, University of Michigan, University of Colorado, who had trainers in their rec centers take the course that we teach. But it wasn't enough just to like educate the staff. They also have to then take the steps towards sometimes you have to like actively recruit people with disabilities because the general assumption might be that that place isn't for them just because that narrative has always been perpetuated for them. They're used to environments not being suitable for them. So trying to get to the point where campus recreation centers are more inclusive and accessible, that's one of my goals.
I think that's awesome. I've been privileged, especially at the University of Richmond, to work with people who are really committed to that as well. They've put themselves through accessibility training, are always asking for my and other people's opinion on how to make even the physical layout and setup, even making sure that the doors and even little things are functioning the ways, making sure showers are accessible. People don't think about that piece. It's not even just the equipment and all that stuff and having accessible equipment in the training, but also like, are your showers accessible? Do they work? Do you have good, stools for people to shower in? People don't think about those kind of things. And so I've been fortunate enough at the University of Richmond to have people committed to that. I think there's always in every college and university, inclusion is an ongoing process, right? It's part of the wonderful part of the work is that it's never dull. It's always changing, and it's a constant work and a constant thing you have to be vigilant about, right?
Yeah.
But I think it's really important work. And the thing that I think is important from a rec center standpoint is, students with disabilities need to know that they can and should be active. They can and should be athletic. I mean, one of the things we try to do, for example, at the University of Richmond, if we have a lot of students that are struggling with, say, anxiety or depression, which is a pretty common disability that affects a lot of our students, we don't just want to refer them to the counseling center. Yes, we want to do that, but we also want them to know that they are also welcome in the rec center. So it's not just about even dealing with people with physical disabilities, but also dealing with those that are neurodiverse. One of the things I talk about is not just assuming that everybody knows that, you let slower people pass or that you wipe down machines, because people with autism who might have difficulty interacting might not know those understood rules. So having signs and people trained to help communicate those so that it's a more inclusive environment, understanding that you're going to have neurotypical but then also neurodiverse students that are going to be interacting with each other, and we want it to be a safe an inclusive environment. And also, I think one of the toughest challenges, and this is beyond disability, but for campus rec centers, is how do you create an environment where people who maybe don't have the ideal body type, and I'm not even talking about disability here, feel welcome. Some people feel intimidated, like, do I want to go in the rec center with all the skinny fit people or the really muscular people, right? And I think that one of the advantages that we have at the University of Richmond is that it's open to some community members. There's a limited number of community members that use our space. What's really cool about that is that you go in the morning, and I use the indoor track. There's an indoor track and do my running sometimes. And there's people that are, 20, but there's also people that are 60 and 70. And so you see a lot of different body types. I think that's a positive thing as well, because it makes it just by virtue a more inclusive space than if you only see young, fit 20-year-olds. Because if you're the person who has anxiety and depression, and so you're anxious about stuff, you may feel anxious about going into a place where you think everybody's going to be staring at you because you've never worked out before, you don't belong, or you don't know how to use the equipment. So, like, thinking not just about the physical nature, but the invisible nature, and the way that those things can intersect.
Yeah, absolutely. We talk about the multidisciplinary aspects of accessibility and inclusivity. That, like, accessibility wise, it's not just a physical environment. There's definitely some degree of psychological safety, and the fact that, like, inclusion is kind of an emotion you experience. It's not just enough for me to throw you into a gym environment and say, like, hey, I'm being inclusive because this person with cerebral palsy is working out in my gym. I have to make sure that the experience that you're having is the one that you want to have, and I have to take the steps towards supporting that. I like that you mentioned the intimidation factor, not only for people with disabilities, but for the general public as well. I think that's been one of the really nice unintended consequences at my gym. We're at the heart, we're like a strength and conditioning facility, so we want people that are training for a specific goal with a lot of structure and scaffolding. But I think a lot of people in our community see our staff as empathetic because we support individuals with disabilities, and it might be those people who want to get into a fitness routine, but they don't know where to start, and they might be intimidated by an environment, and they seek out our coaching because they recognize that we're probably able to support them. So when I try to encourage gyms to become more inclusive, there's a lot of benefits that go beyond just those people with physical disabilities. You're going to attract a whole larger market just by kind of creating a more safe and inclusive space.
And I think it improves the mental health of the people around you, because that's a big part of why exercise is so important, not just for the physical health, but also the mental health and emotional health benefits, especially in high stress environments like college campuses, where, you talk about, like, places you worked at, like the University of Michigan, like our school, University of Richmond, but other colleges as well. There's a lot of stress there. So again, we want to advocate for counseling centers, but we also want to use all of the resources available to see health as, it's not just the role of disability services or CAPS or student health, but the entire university to buy into a holistic approach to health that's going to make it more inclusive for all people, including those with disabilities.
What are the biggest challenges that you've faced in getting DEI initiatives enacted within the university?
I think any university, universities can move at slow paces, right?
Yeah.
They can be bureaucratic. And so I think for me, it's just about understanding that I see inclusion as a set of relationships. So if you ask me what I do for my job, the way that I see it is, we help in student disability services, for example. Students with disabilities manage their relationship to the institution, and we help the institution and the people in it manage their relationship to the students. And so I see inclusion, which I define as environments that accept, embrace, educate, and empower people with disabilities to make choices about their lives. So I see inclusive environments as a set of relationships, because how included you feel has to do with the relationships you have with people within a given space, right? So you can feel as included or excluded based upon the positive or negative impact that a relationship may have had with somebody. So seeing it as a set of relationships. And so I think when you get into this work, you have to be in it for the long haul, and you have to be about cultivating relationships, consistently doing training, consistently being committed. It is, I think, the most rewarding work that you can do, because we get to touch, what I like about my job, I get to touch every single aspect that touches the lives of students at the university. So everything from classes they take when they first come in, to student dining services, to housing and residence life, to athletics, to student jobs, to inside the classroom with faculty, to career services. Like, we did a really cool thing where, made University of Richmond a workforce recruitment program site, which is a program to help people with disabilities get jobs. but we did a podcast with Career Services where I talked about how to disclose your disability in the workplace. When should you, how should you, and to whom should you? So thinking about ways in which you can build effective partnerships. And that's, I think, what you have to understand that at I think the challenge in some places, and luckily I'm not at one of these, is that people will sometimes, well, that's the role of the special educators or the disability office, or, you know, in a K through 12 setting, that's the role of the special education team, or that's the role of the inclusion trainer within a gym, because some gyms will have like trainers when truthfully inclusion for all is the role of everybody involved in that. And so I think getting people to buy into understanding that everybody has an important role to play in the inclusion space, I think is the key thing. So I think one of the hurdles is getting people not to be siloed, but to build those collaborative relationships.
Yeah, we talk about inclusion and adaptive fitness not existing as a separate program. It has to be built within like the ethos of a environment. Like you can't just, like you mentioned, you can't just have one or two people at a facility that are dedicated to supporting all the people with disabilities, because what happens when you walk into the gym and that person's not there? Do you just get turned away? So it has to be like holistically adopted. I like that idea of inclusion as relationships. What influenced you to pursue the career path that you have, and was there a trajectory in terms of what you did before the university?
Well, you know, what's interesting for me is that for most of my life, I hated my disability. My work is largely in identity for that reason. So I've written two books around identity because for most of my life, I didn't like my disability, didn't really like other people with disabilities. And my story is not that uncommon, right? A lot of us try to fit in, we try to hide our disability because being disabled is you are marginalized. You're told that there's something wrong with you, that you're broken, that you need to be fixed. And you internalize that. You can internalize that. And that was me. And so for most of my life, I tried to fit in and be normal and not be disabled. Then when I was 27, I had what I call the born again experience, where I call it being born again with a disability, where I fully embraced my disability and decided I wanted to work with people with disabilities and create spaces where they could grow and nurture and be the best version of themselves. And I wanted to be a mentor for those people with disabilities to try to help in some small way make a difference. And so that's how I got there, was that, you know, I had gone to college and to be a sports broadcaster. I always loved sports. I wanted to be the next Marty Brennaman, the broadcaster for the Cincinnati Reds for a long time. And then decided I was going to become a history professor, but I never felt normal. Was going back actually just to become a teacher. And then I had this experience where I recognized that all the things I had been fighting about my disability were due to societal stereotypes that I had bought into, that had become so internalized in me that I had bought into them. And so I then decided I wanted to get a PhD in education and work with students with disabilities. And so that's how I ended up in my career. And then I started, you know, after I got my PhD, I started in 2012 working at an open enrollment community college in Ohio, where I worked at Clark State Community College, which was a great place to start my career. And I also taught history classes on the side as an adjunct professor because I have a master's degree in history, among other things. And then I went to Queen's University of Charlotte, which is a small sort of liberal arts place, and then was at Duke, and then most recently the University of Richmond. So I feel very blessed to have the career path that I've had, and for me, it's not a job, it's a vocation. The word vocation comes from the Latin vocatio, which means calling, and I'm not trying to be too over the top, but I feel called to do the work.
Yeah. Yeah, I like all that. What do you think changed when you were 27? Where, and maybe in the years leading up to that, were you resentful of your disability? And then was there a specific moment when you reference it as being born again? But was there a specific moment that you can identify or an interaction that influenced it?
Yeah, so I was reading. It was a very intellectual journey in some ways for me. So I had finished my master's degree in history, and I was reading for fun. I was reading the Prison Notebooks by the Italian sort of Marxist theorist Antonio Gramsci. And what he talks about is the way in which societies control those that aren't in power, right? So he's trying to understand, why don't people who should revolt, in his opinion, that are oppressed by a government or people that rule them, why don't they actually do it? And I was reading that book just as part of my own education journey, and like, you know, and I recognized in the concept of hegemony, and what hegemony is for Antonio Gramsci is the concept that there are certain beliefs or ideas that are so pervasive that people buy into them. Because he argues there's two ways society can control you, right? He argues, and I'm not, that you can either do it through violence or like the use of the military, you crack, or you can also control the way people think by having ideas that become so widespread that people buy into them. And what struck me when I was reading that, I was at a park bench when I was 27 years old. I was reading that, and I was like, wow, there's an idea that being disabled is inferior. And I've spent my whole life buying into this idea. And that was the switch. That was the Archimedean moment of clarity, right? Where I sort of realized, wow, like I've bought into this whole notion of being inferior because I'm disabled and because of my disability, and that's wrong. And that's the moment when it began to all change, when I changed my path and began to do that. And I think part of that had to do with the fact that I had started running again. So I had run cross country on crutches in high school. I had wrestled in high school, but I did it to fit in, to be normal. And what happened? I had stopped doing it after high school because I got tired of people calling me inspirational, and I had kind of gotten out of shape. And my dad had a heart attack, which he survived, but it was a pretty bad one. And it scared me. And so I started working out again. I started running again. And so part of what was part of my journey, I think, was I was getting back in touch with my body in positive ways. I was using my body, disabled as it is, in a very physical way. And I think that helped provide some clarity.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there. Is there a way that your cerebral palsy has improved your life?
I wouldn't trade it for the world now. That's the ironic part. So now I'm a person, like, if you ask me, could I take a pill and make myself not disabled? The answer would be no. Because I love being disabled. I love people with disabilities. And I would say that everything that I am is because I'm disabled.
Do you think that would change if you were able to take that hypothetical pill and that didn't give
No,
you cerebral palsy? I mean,
I,
you could still love people with disabilities. You could still
no,
exist in those communities.
because it's the full human experience. I, and that's one of the things I'm discovering on my own podcast, which we'll talk about later. But when you talk to people and you ask them that question, would you take a pill to make yourself not disabled? Many of them will say no because of because there's nothing wrong. One of the things I've learned now is that I'm not broke. I don't need to be fixed, right? And that's what I mean by disability as a cultural identity. So for me, like, I think my disability, and I'm not going to say it's been entirely positive, but it's been a pretty amazing experience from the perspective of the fact that I could never have imagined all the things that I've gotten to do and learn about myself and people because of the fact that I'm disabled. And so I would not trade it for the world. And that may sound foreign to some people, but that's one of the hallmarks of, the work that I do is truly understanding that. And, for most of my life, that wasn't the case. But since I've been 27 years old, I'm 46 now. So for the last 19 years, I've really tried to live up. Now, that doesn't mean I don't get frustrated by some aspects of being disabled. I would like to be able to drive. I can't drive because of the vision that I also have. And like using public transportation at times can be flabbergasting and frustrating. So I would like to make those things better. I interviewed somebody that the interview has not been put on the podcast yet, but they said something so powerful. I asked if they would choose to be disabled or not, and they said no, they wouldn't choose to get rid of their disability, but they might take a pill to make them less disabled to do certain things. And there's part of that I think appeals to me. Like, if I could take something and maybe drive or maybe write better. My handwriting is terrible. I might do that, but I definitely wouldn't get rid of the disability. It's complicated, is what I would say.
Yeah, we've had a few guests on our show with spinal cord injuries, and I've asked them whether their life has improved since their SEI, and all three had a unanimous yes. And I don't know, I don't know what made me want to ask that question outside of maybe just giving people that are in that position a little bit of hope that it's not the end of your life. It can just be a new beginning.
Well, one of the things that frustrates me about the way the media portrays it, particularly spinal cord injuries, there's one play and a movie and another movie that I'm thinking of. One is Million Dollar Baby, and the other is Whose Life Is It Anyway? And both of those movies, the Million Dollar Baby, which is a Clint Eastwood movie starring Hilary Swank, where she's a boxer, she becomes paralyzed, and she decides to heroically end her life. Whose life is it anyway? It's an artist who becomes paralyzed, and he decides to heroically end his life. Those are award-winning plays because we love to portray this notion of like the person heroically ending their life, and that's garbage. What I would say is that people with disabilities, and when I meet with students who come into my office, for example, I tell them, you are powerful, you're amazing, you're incredible, and we love you, not in spite of your disabilities, but because you have them, right? Because we live in a world that wants to tell them that there's something wrong with them. And too often we frame this notion that if the thing happened to me, I don't know what I would do. I can't tell you the number of times. This has happened to me multiple times. You'll be on a bus somewhere, somebody's talking to you, and they'll say, because they see the unconscious, man, if I had cerebral palsy, I think I would just kill myself. And you're left in that conversation going, oh wow, well I guess it's good you don't have cerebral palsy then, right? Like, so the notion of the I would rather be dead than disabled, right? Like it's one of those things that I think is too pervasive in our culture, when the truth is, again, if we reframe disability not as the thing that happens to the broken down able-bodied, but as the natural state of being human in a limited body, then that changes the way we understand our reality, and it forces society to adjust to us rather than always making the individual with disability adjust to society, right? That you can still be physically active, and that's partly why I started my podcast, and be paralyzed and have cerebral palsy and be an amputee, be struggling with addiction history, have mental illness. You can still be active and you can be active and have intellectual disabilities, right? I'm very excited. I've been doing an interview with somebody from the Special Olympics of Virginia to talk about the role they play in providing athletic opportunities. And so, understanding those things I think are really important.
Yeah, the other pervasive narrative, I guess, in Hollywood and maybe literature as well is the inspiration one. And you mentioned in earlier, just kind of in passing, that you hated being called inspirational. Can you maybe wax poetic on what the issue is with people with disabilities being perceived as inspirational?
Yeah, I don't know if it'll be poetic, but it's what we call in the literature the supercrip. So you portray people as superhuman for doing human things. One, it can create unrealistic expectations for people with disabilities. When I teach in my history of disability classes, one of the things I do, I have a headline of a picture that's taken of me running. And I like the picture because it's a good form of me running on crutches. But the headline reads, disability, what disability? The implication being that because I run, I don't have a disability. And I always tell them, well, that seems kind of ludicrous, right? Like, I still have a disability. In fact, it's part of the reason that I run, right? So the notion of the supercrip, it's hard on the person with a disability because you feel like you constantly have to prove yourself. It's mentally and exhausting. It can prevent people from getting the resources they need. It can also create unrealistic expectations for others with disabilities. And it also, for people who are able-bodied, is damaging for them because then they think anything that is done that is like somewhat normal is somehow superhuman. And that's not the reality for most people with disabilities. It is a very pervasive narrative, especially in the sports world, which is why I'm so glad you're doing this podcast. And again, not to talk about mine, but why I wanted to do mine was to talk about disabled athletes, not as supercrips, but as athletes who are living with disabilities, right? And not focus on like how heroic they are because they play wheelchair basketball or quad rugby or adaptive rowing or goal ball or whatever it is they're doing, or, going hunting and fishing, but just talk about like, what is it like to do those things with a disability, and not portraying them as constant heroes or inspirations.
Yeah, I guess one of the issues I would see with that is that it almost implies that those with disabilities who don't play sports are less important, or that they don't want to try hard, or that they don't want to work hard, in which case some people just aren't interested in that. So, yeah, it just kind of, I think it perpetuates a narrative of low expectations for people with disabilities when you see the individual accomplishing a minute task and being praised. I go both ways though, because I don't want to diminish the amount of effort that might have gone into that minute task being accomplished. It might seem minute to me, it might seem minute to you, but it might have been years in the making for the individual. So it's both ways. I would never want to diminish someone's accomplishments because they don't seem super strenuous, but I also don't want people with disability or people without disabilities to feel obligated to praise everything that someone with a disability does solely because of the presence of their disability.
Yeah, I think that's one of the big questions is how do you praise somebody or show them that you do have respect for what it is they do? I think, that there's not an easy question there, but I think ultimately one of the things I've had to learn is it used to really bother me, right? Being called inspiration. And now what I realize and what I would tell other people with disabilities is like, look, you have to do the things you want to do, and then like people will either find what you do how they find it, and you actually can't control that. I spent a lot of time when I was angry and before I accepted my disability, like worrying about what other people thought, and like you can't really control that, right? So one of the things that I've learned now, especially being a runner, I just actually had to come to the terms of yes, there are some over the top praise that I receive, but also part of running culture is that you see somebody else out there running, you say, "Hey, you're looking good," because I do it to people that
Yeah.
are able-bodied. Like I'll be out running in my neighborhood. I was this morning. Somebody was out running the dog. They were jogging. I said, "Looking good." They said, "Looking good back." And so that's part of the running culture. And also, just for me, it was like letting go of the control. Like because some people may find me inspirational. Some people may find me annoying. I can't really control that. All I can do is be the best version of myself. And I think, for people who are able-bodied, I think what I would say to them is if you would praise somebody who isn't disabled for doing something, then I think it's cool to do that, right? But I think ultimately, like, um, not being over the top with it or assuming that like that's why they do it. I mean, one of the challenges that I have when I run races is everybody says stuff to me because like when you run on four-arm crutches, you're kind of like a unicorn. Like people are like, what is this? And the challenge for me is people want to praise me, and I'm fine with that. But like, I don't have the energy in say a half marathon race to run a 14-minute mile and then say like respond to everybody who wants to respond to me. And so sometimes I feel like people might think I'm a jerk because the philosophy that I've developed is I'm just not going to respond to anybody because I don't have the energy to pick and choose who I'm going to respond to. And it's not that I don't appreciate the praise, but like when you're like I ran at Disney World and ran for charity this past year, and like when there's literally hundreds of people, everybody that passes you by is saying something to you, like you just don't. I do not have the energy to say something to all of those people and run on crutches at the same time.
Yeah. So you complete your first half marathon. What would you want the story, the headline to read, or what would you want people to write about you?
Well, let's see, I've done 14. So when I did the first one, it was like I just made it because I that was the worst race I've ever run. Because when I did it, I didn't really. I mean, I was running like 3-4 miles a day, but I hadn't done any long runs. And then I started out too fast because I was all excited, and it took me 4 hours. And so it was brutal. And so I learned from that, and then I trained the next year, and I went from 4 hours to then I ran 3:09, and then I've just kind of been hovering around the 3 hour mark. One time I broke in 3 hours, and that was 2 years ago. I ran the Tobacco Road half marathon in Cary, North Carolina, and and I really was committed, and I did a bunch of running, and I lost a bunch of weight, and it was cool to do that, especially as an old, middle-aged runner to be able to out there and get my PR was pretty awesome. I think for me, it's that I think in general, what I want people to say about me is that he did the best that he could with what he had, and that he made the world a little bit better place for his presence in it. One of the things that I've recognized about myself. So I'm obsessed with Steve Prefontaine, the Oregon distance runner, the very famous Oregon distance runner who passed away in 1975 in a car wreck, is in the running world is still a cult figure in ways that are almost hard to explain almost 50 years since his death. But in the movie Without Limits, there are two movies about Steve Prefontaine. One is called Prefontaine, one is called Without Limits. In the Without Limits movie, there's a quotation that his coach says where he says you should be thankful for the limits you have, because they're about as limitless as they come in this life. And when I think about my own limitations and what I've been blessed to be able to do, I think that myself. I have to be thankful for the limits I have, because they've been about as limitless as they come in this life.
Yeah, I like that. One of my passions is how to make running more accessible and inclusive. Obviously, I've been involved with Team Hoyt for 10 years. Jacob and I have done about 100 races together. What are the biggest barriers that you've faced participating in races, or what do you think races could do more effectively to support athletes like yourself?
So, a couple of things I want to say. So, one of the biggest challenges, and we haven't talked about this in the adaptive rec space, and one of the people that I interviewed on my podcast, a woman named Jennifer Malwini, who's awesome. She does stuff with Walt Disney. She uses a wheelchair. Is the cost of the equipment for people is really expensive. So the cost of equipment, a high end race wheelchair can be $16,000. A high hand cycle can run anywhere from $5,000 to $12,000. And it's important for people to understand, like, insurance doesn't really cover that. So like that's a huge barrier to access. Like the crutches that I now run on, which are custom fit titanium crutches, which are also my everyday crutches. And I have two pair of those because you always gotta have a spare. But those cost $1,000, and insurance did not cover them. So I was blessed enough to be able to save and work and buy those crutches. My tips that I last about 3 months, those are $40 a pair. So one of the big aspects for people either using wheelchairs or crutches or any type of adaptive equipment is A, it's really expensive. B, it's not like rolling down to Dick's Sporting Goods and like, okay, I'm just going to get a chair, or I'm going to get a pair of crutches, or I'm going to get all those things. Like, you don't know how to do it. You don't know what companies to do it. You don't know what grants are available. There's organizations out there, but you don't know how to do it. There's also not a good place to like test out the equipment. So if you want a racing wheelchair, like again, where are you going to go to like see if it fits and get a custom fit? Is it right fit for you? So that's a real challenge, right? Like, how do you do that? So all of those things are challenging. I think the other thing that races should do is have more run walk events, because if something is a 5K, like I don't care, but if something is a 5K, and it's just a run event, you're going to lose a lot of people who might want to walk it or might have disabilities. I think having adaptive divisions, even if there's not a lot of people in them, it's one of the things that like I did the Charlotte, North Carolina half marathon when I lived there. They do this really well, is like just by having a division for disabled runners or people in wheelchairs tells people with disabilities I'm welcome and that the route's probably going to be accessible. Because that's the other thing is like, if I'm a wheelchair racer and I go to my local 5Ks, are they going to be weird and go off in the grass somewhere? Right? Because you never know that in some of these local 5Ks that aren't like the big city road races, right? So that's a big piece, like posting your maps online. And honestly, I'm not saying every 5K has to be accessible, but like if it's not accessible, just being upfront about that so that people don't kind of, waste their time. Like, should I sign up for this? And then again, I think, having mentors, I always say when I ran cross country in high school on crutches, at that time, this was 1990, I graduated in 1996, ran cross country from 93 to 96. We think I might have been the only person in the country doing it on crutches at that time. So there was like nobody, I had really supportive people, but there was like nobody I could go to ask questions of like, what gloves should I use? What crutches should I use? What should I do? There was nobody who could teach me like how to do this. So one of the other things I would encourage is people to get involved in online communities that can help them learn, like, what tires you should use for the wheelchair. What kind of gloves protect your hands? That's actually, people ask me what hurts the most, is it your feet? No, it's my hands, because I'm grabbing onto something for 2 hours. Or if I'm wheeling, I'm not, but if somebody's wheeling, it's their hands and their arms, right? So like helping them understand what they can do to protect those hands and make sure those hands are okay. All those things I think are important things that we have to understand, and figuring out a way to make the equipment more cost effective. I would love to see insurance companies, this is one of my personal things, like actually invest in equipment so that people with disabilities can get outside in more affordable ways.
Yeah, I like all that. We're working on a resource for race directors with just small strategies that they can do to make their race more accessible and inclusive. And it's small things like you said, like including the course map. We did a GoPro video like walkthrough of our course. My gym has a 5K next Saturday, so we're just like leveraging aspects of UDL. So some people want to see it, some people want to watch it, some people want to read it. Just like making sure that it's accessible, not just physically, but also cognitively. We kind of go through this practice of like, if I can't see, can I pick up my bib? If I can't hear, do I know where to go to pick up my bib? Just kind of going through this process, this iterative process of like how accessible is my race, and then I want to put that into a manual to share with other race directors.
I mean, one of the things I would say is like, and I'll use Disney, which does a great job with runners with disabilities, but you have to pick up your bib at the expo. Like, you don't have a choice. You have to pick up your bib at the expo. They won't, like, well, like, that can be overwhelming for all kinds of people with disabilities. Like those big, especially bigger races. Like if you're, like one of the big 5 marathons or to race like Disney where there's thousands of people, or like, the Columbus Half Marathon, which I've done in Columbus, Ohio, like there's 11,000 people doing the marathon, half marathon that day. So like having to go to the expo to pick up your bib can be like really overwhelming for people with disabilities. And is the expo accessible? Like they didn't, like the Disney one, they didn't have good signage. And so we walked all the way around and then recognized that like all the elevator we had to get on was actually 5 steps from where we entered the building. But there wasn't a sign that like said that. So we walked all the way around this path when we literally could have taken 10 steps. And, so like that's an example of like, could signage be better? Thinking about how to make the expo, if you're going to make people pick up your bibs, for reasons that make sense, I think sometimes. Like, is the expo itself, is the signage good? Is the expo accessible? Is it overwhelming for people that are neurodiverse, right? Like, how can you make it less overwhelming for those people that are neurodiverse? I think rules that say, like, you have to pick up your own bib can be exclusionary, even if there's good reason. I get it. They don't want other people using other people's bibs. There's good reason to do that, especially for some races. But for some people that are neurodiverse, that might be an exclusionary thing that keeps them from engaging in the activity itself.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there's a lot of things we could talk about. I'm sure we have a lot of similar thought processes when it comes to making endurance sports more accessible. I guess what inspired the rejuvenation of an athletic career, the rejuvenation of running? Like, what got you back into it, and why did you feel the need to go to 5Ks and half marathons and kind of push the boundaries there?
Again, my dad had his heart attack, and so I just started working out, and like I like pushing myself. And the first 5K I did, which was a 5K that happens in Athens, Ohio, every October, where they call it the Run for the Ridges, which is it was what used to be called the old insane asylum, and it's called Run for the Ridges, and you run, and it's a very popular race. And I just like the vibe of races, so I started doing races, and then I was like, well, I should push myself and do half marathons, and I enjoyed that distance. I've never done a full marathon because I don't really want, like, it takes me 3 hours to do a half, and I don't really want to run for 6 hours. Like for me, the half marathon is like sort of the perfect personal way I want to push myself. And then I even had the opportunity to be a volunteer cross country coach for 3 years because I got hooked up with the local high school team in Athens, Ohio. By the way, for those that don't know, that's the same high school that Joe Burrow, the quarterback of the Bengals, graduated from, to give people some context. So that's where we live. But cool. So I got to be a volunteer cross country coach for 3 years, and that was awesome. Where I ran workouts with the kids every year, and the way that the coach, because I was slower than them, but the way that he used me was every practice he would have me go out ahead on the route, and then they would catch me, and he could time, because I was so consistent with my times, he could time how fast they were by how quick they caught me, right? So the game became catch up to Cort, or pass them twice if we're doing a loop or whatever it was. But every route they ran, I ran. So if they ran 8 miles, I ran 8 miles. If they ran 9 miles, I ran 9 miles. So it really was I just love the sport of running. I love the culture of it. Because it's all about you pushing yourself personally and personal records, and there's just something about running that I find so calming, and my wife calls it my therapy, and there's just a sort of an inner peace to it, right? And I like the idea as a disability advocate that my body, as a running body, as an athletic body, is in juxtaposition to how people see those with disabilities. And so there's some power in that. There's a concept in disability studies called ontological resistance. And what that means is basically the very existence of the disabled body is in and of itself a powerful form of resistance. And so there's something powerful in the concept for me of my athletic body as a person with a disability being in juxtaposition or opposition to the way that people frame disability in general, or those with disabilities, is something that I find powerful.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a couple questions that we consistently ask guests. One being, if you were to go into a gym for the first time and you were going to work with me as a personal trainer, what questions would you want me to ask you about your disability? And because I think one of the barriers for a lot of people that don't have any exposure is etiquette and communication and language, afraid to ask the wrong thing, afraid to phrase things incorrectly. So, what would you want that first session, I guess, to look like?
I think the biggest thing, and this is something I tell everybody, is don't let perfect be the enemy of good. Which I think we often do in the world, right? Like if we can't do something perfectly, it scares us away from doing it. And so the number one thing is don't assume anything. Don't assume because you've worked with one client with cerebral palsy, for example, that they're all that they're all the same. I'm an expert on my limitations or my disability as it relates to me. And that's all I can really speak to. So I think if somebody asking me the question of, what kind of, like what you would ask someone normally, what workouts are you working to do? Like, can you do anything standing up? Do you need to sitting down? You know, I would want them to, in that first training session, sort of, if I came in on crutches, make me aware of like, do you have any adaptive equipment like an adaptive bicycle, adaptive rowing, an erg machine, for rowing? Do you have any of these kind of things? So I think the biggest thing is not being afraid to make a mistake. We all make mistakes. I've made a ton of them in my career. And so the number one thing is like, don't be afraid to engage and don't be so worried about saying the wrong thing if your intent is pure, right? And then if you say something and somebody says, hey, I would prefer you not say that, just listen, don't get defensive, right? Like that's the other thing. Sometimes we're like, well, I didn't mean, like, well, it doesn't matter if you meant it, that how it was taken. And so just listen to that interpersonal thing. But I think asking and not assuming is the key thing. One of the things that I find frustrating, like in the workout space, sometimes I will fall, right? And people want to help me up, but like my cerebral palsy, it's not always helpful to have people pull you up because of the way my balance works. It's easier for me to get myself up unless I need help. And so people want to run over and quickly pull up. And so like if you see somebody fall that's disabled, for example, asking them like, how can I help you? Or do you need help? And if you see them struggling where they can't get up, like, how can we help you? How can we make this easier? Like one of the things that's often helpful is like, if you're doing stuff on the floor, then having chairs available that you can bring over and people with disabilities can then use a chair to kind of pull themselves up. And that's something that people don't think about in the gym is it can be hard for people with disabilities to get off of the floor, but it's like, it's really important. One of the first person that I interviewed on my podcast is a guy that I wrestled with in high school who also has cerebral palsy. And he's a year older than I am. And he talks about like he practices getting up off the floor into his chair every day so that if there's ever an emergency happen, he can do that. But like those kind of exercises too, like, so one of the things I would want them to ask me is like, you know, are there any exercises we could do to help you in your mobility in everyday life, right? Because that's part of what the exercise is, right? Like, is also helping people be more functional in their everyday life. So like if they have to transfer in and out of their car, you could ask them, what are the muscles you're using to transfer in and from your chair to your car or from the floor to your chair? And maybe the trainer could work on those muscles if that's something they wanted, right? Like, so they get better at transferring from the chair to the floor, from the floor to the chair, from the chair to the car, from the car to the chair, getting in and out of vehicles, those kind of things. Like, or if they want to get increased flexibility, that's a big thing for a lot of people with physical disabilities, is just having a little bit more flexibility, even getting into bed. Like, I think not being afraid to have the conversation about like, what are the physical tasks that are difficult for you in your everyday life and how can our gym, help you strengthen those muscles so that you can get in and out of the tub, in and out of the bathroom. Like, because that's a big reason why I work out is like I want to be physically fit enough to do a lot of those things.
Yeah, that's like a needs analysis that you should pretty much do with any client who comes in. So maybe some people have athletic goals, some people have ADL goals. One's not more important than the other. But if you start with the end goal, figure out what someone can and can't do. We call it like building a trainable menu. So if you told me like I can kneel comfortably, then okay, kneeling exercises are part of the equation. If you tell me, nah, I can't really kneel comfortably without a bunch of discomfort, then all right, we're not going to do that. Same for manual wheelchair user. Maybe some can transfer to the ground independently, maybe others can't. And all those things just influence, I guess, the exercises you choose. And it'll just, I guess, the disability just becomes another characteristic that you consider in the same way that I would consider if someone's had a recent surgery or a recent injury or has a specific physical goal. Yeah, the goal is just, I guess, one of my goals is just to kind of lower that intimidation that fitness professionals have in working with people with
Yeah.
disabilities.
And know that you're like I tell people you're gonna make mistakes, but if your heart is pure, if you're coming from a good place, if you're coming from a good context, if you're coming from an honest place out, most people with disabilities, that's what we want. You know, we don't want people staring at us like, "Oh, what are you doing here?" You know, because again, gyms are very intimidating places. I mean, they just are, right? I mean, even if I think for people who are not able are not disabled who are able but so-called able-bodied, I think gyms are intimidating places. So I think just engaging with the client in a way that also makes them feel welcome, like, man, I'm super glad you're here, I'm excited, even saying something like I'm excited to work with you, because like oftentimes people with disabilities, we don't get told that people are excited to work with us. It's like, oh God, I got to work with you. Like even physical therapists whose job it is like, I got to work with you. But having a trainer that's like, I'm excited to work with you. Tell me your goals. What do you want to do? Like, because people don't say that to us. It's like, I got to work with you. Right. So having that mentality as a trainer, when you enter the conversation of like, I'm excited that you're here. I can't wait to build and see where we're at in 4 weeks or 6 weeks or however long that training session is designed to last. But like, because again, so that we're not the afterthought, like, oh, like, but you're just as excited to work with me as you would be, if LeBron James walked in your gym, or Kevin Durant, or, Patrick Mahomes, or whoever. Like, you're excited to work with that client who's 50 and just had a stroke, or was in a car accident and just got out of the rehab facility but wants to be more physically active.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, I can vouch for how rewarding that is. And I remember when I first started my career and like having aspirations of training collegiate athletes and stuff. And it was really cool when we first got some, and it still is cool. They're great people, but it's more so the fact that they're great people than they're collegiate athletes. And it got like to the point where some of our most rewarding sessions, like you mentioned, are the ones with a client post-stroke who's trying to get back to doing what he loved before his injury, post-SCI, trying to get back to doing what he loved beforehand. So all those things are really rewarding. Um, and then a question that we ask all the guests to kind of wrap these episodes up is like, if you had one or two pieces of advice to make the fitness industry as a whole more accessible or inclusive, what would you say?
More inclusive equipment, because a lot of the equipment isn't inclusive. So, and if you're a gym that has a pool, some gyms do, like, how do they get in and out of the pool is a big one, right? So, I've had memberships to gyms where pools are included, where like it's difficult to get in and out of the pool. So thinking about those kind of things. So I do think equipment is important. I also think that, you know, creating a space where people that are neurodiverse, like having spaces where people can unwind, not be overwhelmed. Um, you know, yes, there should be places where there could be music, but can there be any spots in the gym where it's a little bit more quiet, right? Because gyms can be very loud. There's a lot of machines. There's a lot of music. Is there a possibility to build a, a a calmer place that's a little bit less intense? I think also creating, and it sounds like you do this, but also, and this is really hard because you can't control necessarily who comes into your gym, but creating a culture among the patients, or among patients, among the people, the patrons is what I meant to say, among the patrons, that like there won't be any body shaming, right? There that everybody that has a body is an athlete. Like one of my favorite signs that you'll see online is, and I believe this, I don't care if you're fast, slow, short, tall, skinny, whatever. If you're out there running, you're a runner. I don't care if you're running a 4 minute mile or a 20 minute mile or a 25 minute mile. If you're out there doing it, you're an athlete. So I think one of the big things is creating a culture. It's one thing to create it amongst the staff, but it's also the staff modeling it so that the patrons who use the gym also are like, hey, you're lifting 5 pounds with a dumbbell. That's just as awesome as somebody doing 500 pounds on a squat, or like whatever the thing is, right? Like, and so like having that thing that everybody in the gym is celebrated, because then that actually gets rid of the super crib mentality. If everybody is celebrated for their fitness goals and for being in the gym, and just going to a gym and making it, people will say, oh, I was slow or I didn't do very well. Well, you did it. You were here. And just getting here, I think, is the rewarding. One of my favorite people who works at the University of Richmond is the receptionist in the morning when I go work out. Her name is Cindy. And it's like 6 o'clock in the morning. She is always smiling. So even when I don't really I'm working out because I just do it every day, but I'm like, I don't really feel like running 4 miles today. But she's like, Cort, how you doing? And she's like, she's happy to be there. And so then I'm like, well, okay, this won't be that terrible, right? And so I think just having the mentality of not, because sometimes people take the gym as this really serious place, and I actually think it should be a really fun place, right? And so I think having people at the front who are always sort of happy and smiling, that can take down some of those barriers.
Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree that it has to be kind of an ethos adopted throughout the entire community. But I think that exposure has been really cool, at least in our kind of micro community of my gym, where some of the high school athletes have become my Special Olympic coaches. They've become best buddies volunteers. Like, I think being neck and neck with people with disabilities has changed their perspective of disability. I shouldn't say I think, I know it has. So if more environments like mine exist, I'd like to assume that it will have a compounding effect, that will create more people like me that have a real passion to try to promote and advocate for inclusion across various industries. And yeah, not to overinflate the importance of my gym, but I do think it can be a vehicle of kind of changing people who can then go on and implement these same principles in their new environments.
Well, I don't think it's overinflating your gym. I think we get caught up in, and I think about it especially as we head into a presidential election year. People get caught up in making these big sweeping changes, and I think change actually happens relationship by relationship, one small gym at a time, one podcast at a time, one interview at a time, one class at a time, one interaction at a time. And I actually think if we spent more time focusing on communities and how we can make those more inclusive on the small level, I think it's a compounding effect. I think we actually need to move away from this notion of the only kind of politics that matters is who you vote for in big national elections, but rather whatever your political stripes, what is important, I think, is being empowered in your local community to make your community a place that is more human, more inclusive, just by doing small things. The small things you can do in people's lives make a huge difference. I mean, my life got changed for the better when I was, 15, and my wrestling coach, because I wrestled at the time, said, why don't you come out for cross country, John Galbraith, an important member. That was a small thing. He didn't have to do that. I was obviously not going to win any running championships by him having me on the team, because I was not fast. I was running on crutches, right? But he did it anyway, right? And so those kinds of things, those kind of small things, that's where true change happens.
I think that's a good way to encompass a lot of the things that we talked about today. So, Cort, I appreciate you coming on. Look forward to sharing some links in the show notes to the podcast that you host as well. I think a lot of our listeners would get a similar benefit and enjoyment out of the stories that you share as well. A lot of overlap in terms of the messages that we're trying to communicate. So if people want to connect with you, we'll include the exact URLs and et cetera in the show notes to make it a little easier. But where would you recommend that they find you?
They can definitely, like I said, they can listen to the podcast, which is Sports Identity and the Disability Blue. That's wherever you get your podcast. You can email me directly at, and I'll send this, but cort.schneider@yahoo.com. So you cort.schneider, take emails. You can always email me if you have questions or concerns, or you're just passionate about, fitness, disability, or any kind of other things. I love having good conversations and creating spaces where we can learn from each other and be more human and vulnerable with each other.
Yeah, I love that. Well, thank you again for joining me today. I look forward to sharing this.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the AdaptX podcast. Our effort to amplify the ideas of our guests and create more inclusive and accessible industries is futile unless these episodes reach a larger audience. If you enjoyed our discussion today, please leave us a rating or a review on whichever platform you use. And if you would like to learn more about AdaptX, the course that we teach to health and fitness professionals and the projects that our organization is working on, you can subscribe to our newsletter through our website, www.adaptx.org. Until next Monday.